So thank you so much, Ariane, for coming on the podcast and also willing to share your story and the work you are doing for the people of my podcast. And thank you so much for taking this time today in Berlin and also in this evening. Uh,
Well, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. I think it was just one conversation over a lunch or brunch, and then I
Yeah.
think it turned out to be a podcast. So that's how things happen usually. So for people who obviously don't know about you and your journey, can you give you a little bit of view on where, who you are and where you're coming from, and then we can go into the particulars of our conversation today.
Sure. So my name is Arianne Reyes. I'm from the Philippines. I'm a lawyer by profession, and right now I do some work in the development sector. Um, I'm currently in Berlin. I actually came here a few years ago to do a master's in public policy, and a few years later, well, I'm still here trying to figure things out. But yeah.
Yeah, Berlin is obviously quite exciting city, and I think
Oh yeah.
and it's always a lot of people in Berlin are always like kind of thinking about what to do and also rethinking about their careers, rethinking about their life. So it's a kind of familiar background and environment for doing that kind of retrospection and also reflection on where you want to go next.
Oh yeah. It's definitely that.
So, Ariane, I think you mentioned that in our conversation when we were not recording that you come from Philippines and it's quite an
Mhm.
important time in the calendar year for Philippines because of election. And I think it would be interesting to also just give your view on what's happening in Philippines at the moment, uh, especially for people who are listeners who may not have understanding of the current structure and what is election is all about. So that will then we can then talk about the particulars of the work you are doing in that.
Sure. Just for information, we have presidential elections coming up next week, actually on the 9th of May. And we hold these elections every 6 years. That's under the Philippine Constitution. And so this year, we have to elect a president, a vice president. So I know in some countries, such as, for example, in the US, normally whoever you elect as president, or I mean, if you elect someone as president, you automatically elect that person's running mate as vice president. However, in my country at least, the president and vice president are elected separately. We also have to elect 12 senators as well as members of Congress and different local government officials. So this year, and then every 3 years we have midterm elections. But since we have presidential elections this year, I would say it's a major thing. And in particular, I would say this election year is quite significant because well according to the surveys, the front runner is the son of our former dictator, and his running mate is the son of Duterte, the current president. And that, I mean, honestly, for people like myself, that has actually been alarming. But so far, I mean, I guess it's just really too soon to tell what the results of the elections will be like. But there's so many people like myself who are volunteering to help get the opposition candidate get elected. Just to clarify, there are actually 10, if I'm not mistaken, 10 candidates running for president. But the surveys show that there are two, I guess, main players or two front runners, and the candidate whom I'm supporting, Len Robredo, she's actually the current vice president of the Philippines, and she's the one right now who's running for president along with her running mate, who is an incumbent senator, Senator Kiko Pangilinan.
Okay. You mentioned about you use the term alarming when
Yeah.
you describe this. Can you zoom into that a little bit in terms of what is alarming for you in this election, and also just give us a little bit of background on what led to that?
Wow. I don't think the time we've allotted for this session is enough, but just to give a brief background.
Sure.
In the 70s and 80s, my country was under a dictatorship. So, former President Marcos declared martial law, and under his regime, there were, there were many, or there was a large amount of human rights violations that were documented. So many thousands of individuals who were killed or who were disappeared, and it was just, I would say, a very dark time in Philippine history. Apart from that, there have been many, there's a lot of evidence to show that his family basically emptied the nation's coffers, and enriched themselves with the taxpayers' money. And that has been, and there have been many cases in the Philippines, even in the United States, that prove, that prove such fact. And the thing is, so after in 1986, sorry, Vivek, I'm just going to give you the story. You can cut this as you want.
You
So in
can give me
1980, yeah,
the story as you
okay.
feel it. That's completely okay.
Okay, sure. In 1986, President Marcos was deposed, basically through a, they call it people's power. So people went in the streets, and there was what people deemed to have been a peaceful revolution. So he and his family fled to Hawaii, and long story short, democracy as we know it today was restored. We had a new constitution in place, and from that time, we have been pretty much operating in a as a democratic and relatively free society. I mean, there's so many other problems, but I guess that's a conversation for another day.
Hmm.
And so we had, every 6 years we hold elections. In 2016, the current president, Rodrigo Duterte, was elected into power, and I mean, he was at that point very quite popular because he was saying he would solve the country's drug problem, among others. And then he claimed to, basically just make life better for many people. And a lot of the electorate really saw him as a symbol of hope. However, 6 years later, here we are. I This is my personal opinion, of course. I don't think there has been change for the better. For example, he implemented that his so-called war on drugs, which basically led to the killing of so many people who, in particular, many of them were poor. They did not undergo due process, and like for me, it was just really heartbreaking and really alarming that you have someone who claims to want to do away with the country's drug problem, but then you end up with so many poor people killed in the streets, or in their homes, when there's no proof, and then at the end you don't even know, whether they were even involved with drugs to begin with. So it's been a very, in my opinion, a very dark time in our history. And so back to your question, after that long-winded um,
Which was useful, actually, just
yeah,
for people who
explanation.
don't know the situation there.
Yeah. I mean, I find it alarming because when candidates filed their certificates of candidacy late last year, um, so we have one of the candidates, Bongbong Marcos, who is the son of former President Marcos, who filed his candidacy for president. And we have his running mate, Sara Duterte, the daughter of President Duterte. So for people like myself, we are very, I would say concerned, but concerned is actually an understatement of what a Marcos Duterte presidency and vice presidency would look like for our country. Because, for instance, the Marcoses have never apologized for what they did to our country. They have never returned any of the ill-gotten wealth up to now. I Up to now, there's so many myths that have been perpetuated. Of course, I don't have proof. I cannot say that we can pinpoint them as the source, but you do the math. Um, so it's just been alarming that someone who has basically lied to our faces about the atrocities his family is responsible for, about the massive corruption, the massive stealing that his family is responsible for. These acts that I feel at the very least people have to be held to account for. We have It's 20, 30 years later, and there has still been no justice. There's still been no restitution. Philippine taxpayer. I mean, basically, I remember as a child, we were told that, you know, even before we were born, we were already in debt precisely because of what the Marcoses did to our country. And then on the other hand, we have Sara Duterte, who, I mean, it's of course it's hard to you say that the daughter will be just like her father, but um, it's just it, I mean, it's hard not to assume otherwise, because at least based on the way she has been comporting herself or carrying herself, it doesn't appear that there's going to be a massive or a big deviation from how things are. Of course, you want to give someone the benefit of the doubt, but it's quite. I mean, for me at least, it's quite difficult at this time.
Okay. And I think so, if I got this right, it's alarming primarily because of the history that this
Yeah.
family had. And as you said, obviously, I think they haven't faced any retribution so far. And also, it's not very clear if the new leader, also belonging to the same family, would come in and also probably repeat the same atrocities and also complete disregard of the wealth of people. And I'm quite curious to understand, like, how do you see the public perception of the Marcoses family at the moment, especially the leader who is fighting for the new presidencyship in Philippines? How are people reacting to that? Also, I'm assuming they're also aware of the history and the background of this.
Well, I have to admit, so just to give some context, in 2016, when when Leni Robredo, the current vice president, ran for office, she actually ran against and beat Bongbong Marcos. And honestly, at that time, I have to admit, I and people, I guess, in my circle took for granted the fact that people were well aware of martial law, of what happened during that period in our history, about how it was a horrible time for human rights and personal liberties. But that was something we took for granted, and I mean, when I look back, I can't believe how naive I was, because what we realized was, after all these years, there's so many people who remain loyal to the Marcoses, because unfortunately, this is one of those situations that I feel that are very polarizing for society, because on one hand, you have people who really believe that it was the dark ages, and I think objectively it was. There's just so much evidence to back that up. However, a lot of people also say that the martial law years were actually very peaceful. Everyone was disciplined. But of course, my counter statement to that is, of course, people were disciplined. And of course, things were peaceful because people were scared. Otherwise, one wrong move, or if they actually say something in public, they'd get killed or they would disappear or go to jail. So, of course, things were peaceful. And I guess it's very hard sometimes for people to empathize or put themselves in other shoes, because I mean, it's so hard to put into words. I can imagine, for example, if you're a mother and your child was disappeared or arrested, and I can imagine there's just so much pain there, and years later, that's something that will just haunt you. But it's that kind of pain that not everyone feels unless they experience it firsthand, right? So I feel that there's that lack of empathy, which is sad, but it seems to be a reality. Also, unfortunately, I think there is some sort of education gap, because I was lucky enough, because growing up, um, we had teachers who really made it a point to impress upon us the how the importance of martial law in our country's history, and how it's so important that dictatorships just don't happen again, and how bad the situation was during that time. But unfortunately, that does not seem to have been consistent, even in my generation, because I have friends who grew up, for example, in the north, which is where Marcos is from, in the north of the Philippines. And they were saying, we were taught an entirely different history. We were taught that martial law was actually the golden era of the Philippines. And sadly now, they've in a way restructured the basic education system. So we a few years ago we transitioned into the K to 12 basic education system. And from what I've heard, um, history, at least history during the time of, I mean, what relatively recent history or what happened during the time of martial law is not really taught in schools, or if it is, it's just not emphasized so much. So the problem is there appears to be a very big um, I mean, I actually don't know how to describe it, but sometimes I feel that, people from the Philippines live in parallel universes, if that makes sense. So
Mm.
on one hand, there are people like me who, we are aware of what happened and it's something that we know should not happen again. On the other hand, there are people who believe that Marcos is the best president ever, that his family is so great, that they have stores of wealth or they have this hidden gold that they will use to save the Philippines. And unfortunately, social media has not, I mean, has helped perpetuate that myth. So I was very, I mean, I consider myself to be an old millennial. So I have to admit, I'm not so hip. I don't really, I mean, I'm not on TikTok or um, I'm really not up to date with with how the youth these days keep themselves occupied really. But
Mm.
I have heard that apparently many people back home get their information off YouTube, off TikTok, and the thing is it's basically information that has not been vetted or has not been adequately fact checked. So they what I think happens is that people listen to, I don't know, so-called influencers or people whose messages resonate with them, and they take it as the truth when in fact it's not. So it's also, I realized there's a gap insofar as um, or people are just not able to make the distinction between an opinion and historical fact that's backed with data.
Mm.
And it's really hard because sometimes in the it's been the experience that you try to convince someone or you try to talk to them that hey, this is what you're saying might be wrong because that's really not what happened. We have all these records, and then we'll just hear from them that, oh, respect my opinion, and then that's that. And I can understand from a perspective, you know from their perspective, that sometimes they may feel that we're attacking their egos, therefore they become defensive. And yeah, it's not a good it's not a good situation to be in, I think.
Yeah, I think the social media obviously kind of perpetuates the divide
Yeah.
further. And I think, as you rightly said, I think there are like what I heard from you is that obviously people are kind of at at different sides of history based on the type of information that they have consumed or what's presented to them. And I think that's it. It's media is a reality, is a kind of mirror to the reality of how the situation is. So it's not an it's very hard to just say that this will solve all the problems, but it will actually may even worsen it. I'm quite eager to hear also on the other side, especially the leader that you have been kind of also working to create more awareness
Hmm.
of.
Yeah.
Uh, Tell us a little bit about that particular person who is also kind of fighting for this position. What has been
Okay,
her
sure.
background, and what is working well for her in this election? Also, what is not?
Okay. Well, I mean, I personally feel that, I mean, her candidacy, I know it sounds really, cheesy in a way, but her candidacy has really given me hope because for myself, and I would say people in my circle, the past 6 years have been a particularly dark time. Like it's so hard to explain, but I just felt like there's I perpetually walk around with a dark cloud, and
Mm.
I don't want to give in to that feeling of hopelessness, but there are days I'm just like, oh no, is there still hope for my country? Which is really sad because I've always really, I mean, I worked in different government agencies in the past, and sometimes it can be a thankless job, but I find it really inspiring. And at some point I had wanted to go back to doing that sort of work, right? But the past 6 years have just been, I don't know. I felt like I put my life on hold, if that makes sense. But so what happened was when she declared her candidacy, and I think that was in October last year. I I and just so many people I knew got so excited, and I know it sounds melodramatic, but for the first time in 6 years, or well, 5, 6 years, we really felt that there's a chance that we can get out of the situation. Our country can can go back to its upward trajectory. And it was really great because so just to give a background, so Lenny Robredo is she's how old is she? She's 57 years old. She was the wife of the former Secretary of Interior and Local Government, and unfortunately, her husband Jesse Robredo died in a helicopter crash in 2012, if I'm not mistaken. So she was widowed during that time, and her she's also a lawyer. She's a lawyer by profession, and what's really interesting is she spent a significant time of her prior to her entering politics. She spent many years working in the development sector. For example, she spent more or less 12 years working as a, we call it an alternative lawyer, or as a lawyer for an NGO um, that works to support or to provide legal support to we call them marginalized sectors.
Mm-hmm.
So these are sectors such as, for example, farmers, fisher folk, who normally are not front and center when it comes to the government. Who are front and center when it comes to government policy, or when it comes to distribution or allocation of resources. So she used to be a lawyer working for, the name of the NGO is Saligan. I actually used to be an intern for that same NGO, and that was actually the first time I encountered her. Although she was based in a different province, so I think during that time I only met her once. But
Mm-hmm.
anyway, so I think it's because of that. It's because of her background that she basically worked as a lawyer for the people, or as a lawyer for the people in the margins, that I felt even when she ran in 2016 that she was the best possible candidate for the job. Because if you're not familiar, Philippine politics is very, I mean, when you describe it, or when you hear people talk about it, you'll hear things thrown around like political dynasties and patronage politics, and all the for, in my opinion, unsavory things you would use to describe a political system. And but
Mm-hmm.
that's the sad reality. And then here you have someone who does not come from a political dynasty, who has who has worked in the past with people who just need people in the margins who need their voices amplified. Someone with a proven track record and who has been consistent in her advocacies, who decides to take up the cudgels for them, so to speak, and run for national office. So I mean, 2016 was, I mean, I guess that was the start for, I call it a movement in a way, because at that point she wasn't very well known. So what happened was, so she worked as a lawyer for an NGO, and then she ran for Congress in 2013. She won, and then 2016 came, and then suddenly she was propelled into the national spotlight. And that time people were like, oh, she's just the wife of Jesse Robredo. Here we have another widow who wants to, hold a national position. Because our first president after Marcos was deposed in 1986 was the wife of an opposition senator who was killed, or who was murdered. So they were saying, oh, it's the same narrative. She doesn't know anything. But I really think she proved them wrong and more, because apart from, she had, prior to entering politics, she built a career for herself. um I feel that she's been able to really distinguish herself, like for the past 6 years as vice president. She's just done so much, because if you look at the Philippine Constitution, there's the role of the vice president isn't much. It's basically take over in case the president is
Mm-hmm.
incapable or dies, or is just unable to fulfill his duties,
Mm-hmm.
and nothing more. And she and But I feel like she's done way more than that. given the limited budget that her office has always been allocated. For example, she was the first. Her office was the first responder during the COVID-19 pandemic because
Mm.
our country was hit really hard. So in the beginning, because of the lockdown, for example, healthcare workers couldn't even get to their places of work because they had
Mm.
to shut down public transportation. She and her office made a way to, come up with the transportation scheme for these healthcare workers, for example, and they provided a lot of support to hospitals. They came up with they call it the in Filipino, they call it Bayanihan e-consulta, which is basically a web-based telemedicine service where people who need medicines or medical
Mm.
support can, contact them contact them. I think via Facebook, and then I've heard and read so many testimonies of people getting the support they need expeditiously, which is kind of unheard of because the way things move back home. I mean, people always say that, if you want something done or if you need a service, you have to be able to pay for it because
Mm.
otherwise expect to wait forever if you'll even get it. And and also my country is, well, we're in the ring of fire, so we're really prone to
Mm.
natural calamities. And every time there's a calamity like a storm or a typhoon, you can expect that she's among the first who are there to make sure that people who are affected get the support they need.
Mm.
And I think it's just been, really impressive considering that she's had so many detractors for the past 6 years. People, I guess her haters, so to speak, have just
Mm.
thrown all sorts of fake news and issues towards her. Even in places where she lost massively in 2016, she's always the first responder when there's a big typhoon or a calamity. And I think that's really an indication of her, her heart for service and her passion, to help people in any way they can. And I think that's what we need right now because unfortunately, I mean, the Philippines has a population of over 100 million people, but last I checked, almost one fourth of the population was living below the poverty line. So
Mm.
I mean, on one hand, there's development, that's true. And you have people who are, I mean, you have a middle class, you have people who are, living very well, but we can't discount the fact that a vast majority of the population are still living in poverty, don't have access to adequate water, electricity, proper education, for example. And I feel that we just can't stay this way because we're never gonna progress as a country if only the few or if only the elite progress.
Mm.
And I think we really need it's high time we have a president for the people or someone who will really champion their causes instead of taking into consideration what her friends and cronies want or whether or not she's beholden to a certain group of people. We have someone who's not. We have someone who has managed to help countless people without asking or getting anything in return. We have someone who isn't part of a dynasty or has no dynasty to perpetuate.
Mm.
And I really think this is a once in a lifetime chance we have. So that's why I and so many volunteers, both abroad and back home, have really given so much of our time and energy into this campaign. Yeah, I don't know if
In
you want me to talk about I'm sorry, I'm supposed to talk about my experience as a
Of
volunteer.
course, of course. Let's get to that in a moment. I'm quite curious to hear, like, from the way you described different type of problems right now, where there's a possibility of change. If you had to pick maybe three or four such big topics as part of the agenda, which is at stake with the current elections, what would be those big, maybe three or four topics which you feel would be uh, on a critical stake at the moment, based on the outcome of this particular election?
Well, I think one of the most important things on Lanier Brothers' agenda is actually economic recovery post pandemic.
Hmm.
So, I mean, unfortunately, unlike in places like Germany, the pandemic was very, very difficult for people in my country because we didn't have adequate social support. For example, if they
Mm.
lost their jobs or they were laid off because the establishments they were working for closed, it's not like, you know, it's not like the government stepped in and suddenly declared that, we're going to give hundreds of euros worth of assistance to you every month. I
Mm.
mean, at some point, I believe that there was a dole out, but it was a one-time thing. And really, if you have no job or you're underemployed for 1.5 to 2 years, that's really not enough for
True.
yourself and your family.
True.
So, and I mean, I do believe our economy has really suffered. I mean, not just on on a micro level, but on a macro. So, it's really important that we jumpstart that and just get the ball rolling again. In addition, I mean, wow, I feel like there's so many problems that need to be
Mm.
addressed, right? But, I think she also wants to address training of, for example, seafarers, because we have a very large, I mean, we export a lot of manpower or human
Mm.
resources. And, for us to remain competitive abroad, we have to be good at what we do. Otherwise, we're going to be overtaken by other countries, and that's also
Sure.
something that's in her agenda. Um, wow, sorry, I'm still I'm trying to think. I also believe the environment is an important part of our agenda. She recognizes that there is in fact a climate emergency, and that's something we as a country have to address. I mean, we're not an industrialized or very developed country. So, in terms of, for example, emissions, I don't think we rank highly, but it's still
Mm.
a problem because, as I said, I mean, the Philippines is an archipelago. So basically, it's several thousands of islands that form the nation, right? So we're located in the Ring of Fire. So every time there's a natural disaster, you can expect that I mean, we get badly affected. So there have to
Mm.
be proper policies in place to at least mitigate that.
Mm.
And sorry, still thinking. Oh, and I
Go
think
for it.
another important aspect is really strengthening our agricultural industry because we are a primarily agricultural nation. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, we're not highly industrialized, unfortunately. I mean, hopefully, maybe in the future we'll get there, but we're not yet there. So, but we're also a net for some strange reason, despite the fact that we're agricultural and we have just a lot of hectares and hectares of agricultural land. We're a net importer of rice, for example. And
Mm.
then there are all these issues of basic goods being so expensive, which just is I mean which is hard for the common person to afford. And then, but on the other hand, you have all these farmers who are just who are doing backbreaking work but
Mm.
making a mere pittance, which is just really heartbreaking. So there also have to be um, policies in place to not only put food on people's tables but also to ensure that they earn enough so that they can support themselves and their families.
Got it. Let's probably, I think, take a segue to the volunteering experience that you had. Tell us a little bit about how was that experience for you in terms of, I think obviously you're out of Philippines at the moment in Berlin. How did you arrange to kind of create awareness with the amount of influence that you have in the community that you are able to talk to? And also this is it will give us obviously a view of how volunteering can really affect to kind of steer away or also I mean steer forward to the particular candidate you're supporting. But also I think I'm quite also interested to see what are the challenges that you faced in the volunteering experience that you had for this election.
Well, I mean, to be honest, I'm just so tired. No, but don't get me wrong. I'm not complaining. I'm volunteer. I'm a volunteer by choice, and I'm happy to
Hmm.
do so. It's just that it's just that there is a lot to do.
Hmm.
So I mean, I have to admit, as I mentioned earlier, it's just so hard to describe. But I was just so inspired and so happy when she declared her candidacy, and so many people back home. I feel reacted the same way because suddenly, because her campaign color is pink. So suddenly
Mm.
my entire like social media page became pink. All my friends, suddenly changed their profile pictures to something pink. Local brands back home, I'm happy to say these are brands I've always supported and brands I've always liked, suddenly changed their, profile photos to something pink, or
Mm.
posted something pink in support of her candidacy. Um, Local artists I've always liked. I feel so validated right now actually. Artists like musicians or even painters I've always liked and supported, suddenly um, you know, found a way to show their support for her. Like it's
Mm.
it's just been really inspiring the way people on the ground have been responding and doing their, and doing things to show that they support this candidacy. And I would say like this is what you would call a true people's campaign. I mean, fine, there's a central headquarters. Of course, she has a campaign manager and all that, but really, different groups that have been supportive of her have just popped up organically.
Mm.
For example, here in Europe, um, I remember as soon as she declared her candidacy, suddenly, uh, I remember I just saw on social media like friends were suddenly asking, I'm here, I'm in this country, what can I do to help? So people kind of just got together and organized themselves
Mm.
on their own. So, for example, I'm in Germany, and there are several volunteers in Germany as well. So, what happened was we somehow managed to organize ourselves into different country groups, right?
Mm.
And different coordinators were identified. So I'm one of the coordinators. We call it Team Lenny Robredo, Germany. So it's part of a bigger umbrella of volunteers called Team Lenny Robredo. But I mean, honestly, I mean, my personal take on this is a name, but I mean, I'm not, it's not one of those things like, okay, you have to be a member to be able to do something. It's not that, because
Mm.
everyone can do, everyone can contribute so much. So I guess this was just a way for us to organize ourselves. So on our part here in Germany, there are, I mean, in the beginning it was a bit difficult because there are not very many Filipinos in Germany compared to, for
Mm.
example, the UK or Italy or even Spain, at least in Europe. The problem is Germany is a large country, so it was also hard to find people. Like, there are 16 Bundesländer. Prior
Mm.
to the campaign, I just didn't know so many Filipinos in the other federal states, right?
Mm.
And my problem also is, okay, I'm in Berlin, this is the capital, there are Filipinos, but it was also hard to go outside our circles because,
Mm.
for example, the people I knew just knew each other. And I'm like, that's
Mm.
not how you win this. That's not how you run a
True.
campaign, because if we're just talking to each other, we remain confined to our bubble, and that's, we're just not going to win this way, and we're not going to raise
Mm.
awareness about our candidate this way. So I mean, it took a lot of effort, I would say, because, for example, in other countries like the UK, they were able to. I mean, it was relatively easy to organize themselves because there were so many, and I would say the Filipino community is. I mean, since it's bigger, it's easy for people to connect with each other,
Mm.
which was not our experience here. So, I mean, it reached a point where like I was talking people on Facebook, for example, and sending random strange, not I would not so random, but really I was sending messages to strangers, just to invite them, for example, to events.
Mm.
But it was really nice because we were able to build a network. So I've been coordinating with other volunteers from different parts of Germany. So, for example, so last April 23, which was incidentally also the birthday of Lenny Robredo, we held a concert here in Berlin, and there were three other events going on in other cities in Munich and Frankfurt and Hamburg. And it was nice because these and these events were all independent. But for example, like um, so I was coordinating with a volunteer with one of the volunteers from Munich, and she was saying, "Oh, someone from Berlin actually wants to go to my event." But I told her, "You know what? There's actually something going on in Berlin, so maybe it's easier for her to do that."
Mm.
So there's a lot of I guess back and forth, people sharing information, and I really think that helped in terms of information dissemination. Like a few weeks ago, we also had a picnic,
Mm.
and there were people who showed up, and it was such a nice surprise because I didn't know them prior to that day. And they're saying, oh, we actually heard about this from a friend of ours in Frankfurt who sent us a copy of the invitation. So I mean, I guess, as I was talking about how social media is not a good, I mean, sometimes it can be a tool to spread misinformation, but at the same time, I also witnessed how useful it is
Hmm.
in terms of information sharing and just trying to coordinate and broaden one's network. And I think that has also been very crucial for this campaign.
Hmm.
And apart from that, I mean, I have to admit, it's been personally quite difficult for me to be away from home because, um, it's a bit hard to describe, I guess, but I'll try my best. So what happened now is that people are just really going all out for her. Like,
Hmm.
um, there have been rallies in different provinces. And for example, the biggest one, which was held on April 23, there were more than 400,000 people in the streets of Manila just showing their support for her. And, it's just been so inspiring because people with different talents have just been, finding ways to do something to show their support. Like the other day, I saw a video of people who are into, sorry, I don't even know what it's officially called, but who are into jump rope.
Hmm.
Then they just had the whole video of them, um, jumping to one of the campaign songs, for example. And then we have
Hmm.
national artists who have spoken up. Six of the seven living national artists of the Philippines have spoken up in support of her. We have different celebrities. We have different, political groups, of course. We also have different medical groups. We have youth groups. Just showing their support for her. And right now on the ground, and it's really inspiring for me because like every time I check my Facebook feed, for example, I see that I have friends who previously were not very politically inclined, or they never really involved themselves in politics, who really take the time and as in they go conduct house to house campaigns because for them
Hmm.
it's also so important that Lenny Robredo wins this election. And I have to admit, I have these moments of FOMO or fear of missing out because I'm like, I wish I were back home. I really feel that if I were back home right now, I would probably be on the ground conducting house to house campaigns, for example. But I'm here, I'm registered to vote here, and I did commit to help out with the campaign on from here. So what I've been doing also is I've been raising funds to support volunteers doing house to house campaigns because
Hmm.
they're all it's really inspiring. There are all these groups of volunteers in different areas of the Philippines, even in far flung areas in the mountains, for example, who are just so enthusiastic and passionate about this. However, of course, they're volunteers, but there are limitations. Like they need, for example, gas for transportation.
Hmm.
They, of course, need to eat, so they need food. They need campaign materials. So I've been raising funds to support these groups as well. And then I've also been so there are a lot, of course, social media is really important. So there have been a lot of pages on Facebook. I'm not quite sure what they're called, fan pages maybe, or like
Hmm.
groups or something that have been, that word that came up during this time. So I'm actually one of the admins for one of these pages. So, so I guess you can say like I'm online all the time because
Hmm.
I have to basically score the web for interesting content to put up. Then of course you have to think about things like timing
Hmm.
and I have to admit like I mean, prior to this campaign, my background is in law. I've never done anything like social media related, really. But, I've kind of, I've had to learn on the fly. I've had to learn how to come up with witty captions. I mean, up to now, that's still debatable, but I try. So, I mean, I feel that, it is really time consuming. And for the most part, I mean, it's tiring, but at the same time, it's fulfilling.
Hmm.
And yeah.
So if someone is listening to this podcast, and as we have limited time for the elections to happen, what do you recommend for them to be involved in this and lean their support? What would be the best way for them to engage, especially for people who are living in this part of the world and also who want to influence the outcome of that particular election?
Well, first and foremost, if if you have a listener who's a Filipino voter, please vote for Lenier Red and Kiko Pangilinan in the coming elections. If you haven't voted already, because we actually vote by post here in Germany and in many
Mm,
parts of Europe. So I, for example, have already given or submitted my ballot. But apart from that, I think it's also important, for those who aren't Filipinos but no Filipinos, make
mm,
it would be really nice also to have a conversation with them about this.
mm,
And I think that it's just so important to raise awareness about what's going on in my country. I mean, there's so much going on in the world right now, for example, in Ukraine. So I can imagine that for most people, I mean, I can imagine most people are not so familiar with the political situation in my country, for example.
mm.
But I talk about it with my friends as much as I can, because not only am I really passionate about it, but I think it's just so important to raise awareness so that people know what's going on
True.
in my country.
I thank you so much, Ariane. I think for giving at least in the time frame that we had to kind of the background of the situation. So hopefully, for people listening to it and also getting a chance to understand the current situation, but also try to see that there are like so many things going around the world, and I think every I see every outcome of an election in any part of the world kind of affects everyone, irrespective whether
Yeah,
you live in that country or not. Uh,
exactly.
right?
And
So
sorry to jump
no, go
on
for
your
it.
point. I
Go for
mean,
it.
of course, what will happen, or the outcome of the elections, will first and foremost affect us on a domestic level. But I think it will also affect us. I mean, in terms of our relations with the EU, for example, our relations with other countries, and the fact that we export so much manpower.
Mm,
I mean, it. I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, I'm proud of Filipino workers. I mean, I know people really think, we're generally good workers, and I know there's a high demand for them. But behind that, there are always policy. I mean, you won't be able to hire people if you don't have government support, if they don't have
mm.
policies to support that sort of, I guess, export of services. I mean, sorry, as a side note, I have mixed feelings of that, because I also feel that we have to preserve our domestic labor force. But that's a conversation
That's a
for another
completely
day.
different, yeah,
Exactly. Yeah. But
100%,
I mean, I
100%.
you know, but that's yeah. But I mean, I'm just talking about the status quo, and the
Sure.
reality is that's how things are for Filipinos, and I guess I mean, and they say like our greatest export is really our manpower at this point in time, at least.
Mm,
So I
mm.
can imagine um, whoever wins the elections would directly or indirectly have an impact on that.
Definitely, definitely. And I think that's why this was quite important for me personally to also understand. I think for everyone, particularly, just because I think that it's such a connected world, and I think
Exactly. And even
anything.
like you have all these, yeah. I
Go
mean,
for it.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but yeah,
No,
I
no,
was
that's
just
okay.
thinking that, I mean, right now everything is interconnected, and whether you like it or not, what happens in one place would directly or
Hundred
indirectly
percent.
affect people in another place. Or even in terms of, you have all these companies who want to go international, or multinational companies also. And if they want to do business with my country, you need good policies for that too. You don't
Hundred
want to
percent.
deal with a corrupt government. You don't want to deal with a government that you know just has so much red tape or doesn't know what it's doing, right?
100%. And I think that that's the kind of the crux of the message is I think people should be applying critical thinking of not just thinking about first order effects of this outcome, but also the
Yeah.
second and third order effects, which is going to be beyond the boundary of a country, which means it affects obviously the situation in that part of the world, but also globally wherever there's a demand for high talent, and I think Philippines plays quite an important role in that equation.
Yeah.
Super. Again, I appreciate your time for giving to this particular podcast and also sharing your excitement. As I can see, it's 11 o'clock in Berlin. I see you seem excited and
Still
passionate and
alive.
energetic, which is
Yeah.
amazing. And I obviously look forward for a favorable outcome, the one at least you're supporting, and hopefully this turns out to be a good change in terms of the politics of the country of Philippines, but also for the world economy and the world politics.
Thank you very much for the time and for giving me a platform. I mean, to be honest, I've never done this before, but right now I'm just taking every opportunity I get to, as I mentioned earlier, to raise awareness. So thank you, Vivek, for that.
Thank you.